Picture this. It's January 1944, and Sergeant Mike Kovacs is standing in a freezing motor pool outside Anzio, Italy, welding scrap metal to the sides of his Sherman tank while his entire platoon watches and laughs. They're calling it Kovacs's curtains. Someone suggests he add lace trim. The tank commander from 3rd Platoon walks by, sees the makeshift armor skirts hanging off the Sherman's hull like a metal apron, and shakes his head. "You're adding weight we don't need and making us a bigger target," he says. "That junk will get us killed faster than it'll save us." Kovacs doesn't respond. He just keeps welding because he's done the math, and more importantly, he's seen what happens when you don't do anything. 3 weeks earlier, his best friend's Sherman took an 88mm round through the side armor during the push toward Monte Cassino. The shell penetrated clean through the 38mm hull plating, detonated inside the crew compartment, and killed everyone instantly. The tank burned for 6 hours. They never recovered the bodies. That image is burned into Kovacs's brain, and if his platoon wants to mock him for trying to prevent it from happening again, that's fine. He'll take the mockery. What he won't take is sitting idle while German anti-tank guns turn his Sherman into a crematorium on treads. The Sherman tank was a monument to American industrial might and strategic compromise. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks in various configurations. That's more tanks than Germany and Britain combined produced during the entire war. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, simple to operate, and could be mass-produced in factories that had been making locomotives 6 months earlier. It was also, by 1944, desperately outmatched by German armor. The base model Sherman M4A. One had frontal hull armor of 51mm at a 56-degree slope, which gave it effective protection, equivalent to roughly 90mm of vertical armor. The side armor was a different story, 38mm vertical with no sloping. That's 1.5 inches of steel between you and whatever's shooting at you. For context, a German Panther tank had 80mm of side armor. A Tiger had 82mm. American tank crews weren't stupid. They could read thickness specifications, and they'd seen enough knocked-out Shermans to know that German anti-tank guns could penetrate their side armor from over a mile away. The 88mm gun was the thing that haunted every Sherman crew's nightmares. Properly called the Flak 18/36/37 depending on the variant, this weapon had started life as an anti-aircraft gun and evolved into the most feared tank killer of World War II. When mounted on a Tiger tank or used as a towed anti-tank gun, the 88 could penetrate 138mm of armor at 1,000 meters. A Sherman side armor might as well have been aluminum foil. The physics were brutally simple. The 88 fired a 9.4 kilogram armor-piercing shell at roughly 810 meters per second. When that shell hit armor, it didn't just punch through. It created a pressure wave that turned the interior metal surface into spalling, razor-sharp fragments that ricocheted around the crew compartment at supersonic speeds. Even if the shell didn't fully penetrate, the spalling could kill or maim everyone inside. And if the shell did penetrate, which it almost always did against Sherman side armor, it would detonate inside the tank, igniting ammunition, fuel, and crew members with equal enthusiasm. Sherman crews had calculated their odds, and the math was terrifying. In Normandy during the summer of 1944, the average lifespan of a Sherman tank in active combat was estimated at 6 missions. Not 6 months, 6 missions. A veteran tank commander who survived 20 engagements was considered either blessed by God or in league with the devil, because statistically, he should have been dead 15 engagements ago. The crews developed dark humor about it. They called Sherman's Ronsons after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was "Lights first time, every time." When a Sherman got hit and caught fire, which happened with depressing regularity, crews had about 9 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off and turned the tank into a bomb. Escape hatches that seemed perfectly adequate during training became death traps in combat. when you're trying to squeeze through while the guy in front of you is on fire and the guy behind you is pushing and the tank is filling with smoke and you can hear ammunition starting to pop. The Army knew they had a problem. Field reports from North Africa in 1943 had already highlighted the Sherman's vulnerability to German anti-tank weapons. By the time American forces landed at Normandy, tankers were filing complaints so consistently that Ordnance Department officials were drowning in paperwork documenting every way the Sherman could be killed. The official response was essentially, "We're working on it." The M4A3E2, nicknamed the Jumbo Sherman, was being developed with frontal armor of 177 millimeters and side armor of 76 millimeters. That would help. The problem was that only 254 jumbos were ever produced, and they didn't start arriving in Europe until late 1944. For the tens of thousands of Sherman crews already in combat, "We're working on it," wasn't helpful. They needed solutions now, and if the Army wasn't going to provide them, they'd improvise. Field modifications started appearing in Italy during the winter of 1943-44, born from desperation and scavenged materials. Tank crews began welding anything they could find onto their Sherman's hulls. Spare track links were popular because they were readily available, made of hardened steel, and could be welded directly onto armor plating. Some crews created crude skirts using sheets of steel, salvaged from destroyed vehicles, building facades, or even ship plating from damaged landing craft. The designs were completely unscientific. Nobody was running ballistic tests or consulting engineers. It was pure trial and error, with the error part sometimes being fatal. A crew from the 1st Armored Division welded sandbags in wooden frames to their Sherman sides, figuring extra mass would help. The weight threw off the tank's balance, strained the suspension, and the sandbags absorbed water during rain, adding even more weight. When that Sherman took an 88mm hit near Casino, the shell went through the sandbags, the wooden frame, and the armor like they weren't there. The tank brewed up. 4 men died. The lesson: more weight doesn't equal more protection. You need the right kind of weight in the right configuration. Kovacs approached the problem differently because he'd been a welder in a Pittsburgh steel mill before the war. He understood metallurgy in a practical, hands-on way that most tankers didn't. He knew that armor penetration wasn't just about thickness. It was about angles, spacing, and disrupting the shell's kinetic energy before it reached the main armor. His design used 2 layers separated by air gaps. The outer layer consisted of salvaged steel plates, roughly 10 millimeters thick, mounted on brackets that held them 15 to 20 centimeters away from the Sherman's hull. The theory was simple. When an armor-piercing shell hit the outer plate, it would destabilize, potentially shatter, or at minimum lose velocity before hitting the main armor. The air gap was critical because it prevented energy transfer from the outer plate to the hull. If you welded plates directly to the armor, you were essentially making the armor thicker but also creating a solid path for kinetic energy to transfer through. The air gap broke that path. Getting materials was half the battle. The motor pool sergeant, a career Army man named Gillespie who'd served since 1938, told Kovacs that unauthorized modifications were against regulations, and he wouldn't approve any requisitions for materials. So, Kovacs stopped asking for approval. He scrounged. Every time his platoon passed a destroyed German vehicle, Kovacs was eyeing the steel plating. Every bombed-out factory they liberated had sheet metal in the rubble. He traded cigarettes, whiskey, and favors for welding rods. His loader, a kid from Kansas named Patterson who was 19 years old and terrified of burning to death, started helping. Then the gunner joined in. Pretty soon, the entire crew was involved in the modification project, spending their off-duty hours in the motor pool turning their Sherman into something that looked like it had been assembled by a committee of madmen. The mockery intensified as the project progressed. Other tank commanders would walk by, inspect Kovacs's handiwork, and offer increasingly creative insults. "You building a tank or a garden shed? That thing's gonna fall off the second you hit rough terrain. Jerry's gonna laugh so hard when he sees that, he'll forget to shoot." The worst came from Lieutenant Morrison, the platoon commander, who pulled Kovacs aside after morning formation and strongly suggested he remove the modifications. "You're out of uniform, Sergeant. That tank looks like a rolling junkyard, and it reflects poorly on this unit. I want those skirts removed by 0600 tomorrow." Kovacs looked at Morrison, who was 23 years old and had been in combat for exactly 2 months, and said, "With respect, sir, I'll remove them when you put it in writing that you're ordering me to remove a modification that might save my crew's lives." Morrison didn't put it in writing. The skirts stayed. The first test came on February 14th, 1944, Valentine's Day, which Kovacs later noted was either deeply ironic or perfectly appropriate, depending on how you looked at it. His platoon was supporting an infantry advance near the Rapido River when German forces counterattacked with armor support. 2 Panthers and a Panzer IV emerged from concealment in a tree line roughly 800 meters out. The Germans had the advantage of position, surprise, and superior guns. What they didn't have was enough time to properly range their targets before American Shermans started firing back. The engagement became a confused slugging match with tanks maneuvering for position, while infantry scattered for cover and artillery started falling on both sides. Kovacs' Sherman was attempting to flank around a destroyed farmhouse when the Panzer IV spotted them and fired. The 88mm shell covered 800 meters in roughly 1 second, traveling faster than the speed of sound, meaning Kovacs heard the impact before he heard the gun that fired it. The shell hit the improvised armor skirt on the left side of the hull with a sound that Kovacs later described as someone hitting a church bell with a locomotive. Inside the tank, the crew felt the entire vehicle shudder. Patterson, the loader, screamed that they were hit. The driver started to panic brake, which would have made them a stationary target. Kovacs was yelling to keep moving, scanning for damage, trying to locate the Panzer IV through his periscope, and simultaneously processing the fact that he was still alive, which meant something had worked. The shell had struck the outer armor skirt at an oblique angle, approximately 30 degrees off perpendicular. The impact point showed a deep gouge where the shell's ballistic cap had bitten into the 10mm plate, but the plate hadn't fully penetrated. The shell's core, destabilized by the initial impact and the angular deflection, had broken apart. Fragments hit the main hull armor, but with significantly reduced velocity and energy. The 38mm side armor held. There was a dent, some spalling on the interior surface that caused minor cuts to Patterson's arm, but no penetration, no fire, no catastrophic kill. The Sherman was still combat capable, and more importantly, the crew was still alive. They reversed into cover. Patterson slapped a bandage on his arm, and they spent the next 3 minutes locating and destroying the Panzer IV with 4 rounds of 75mm high explosive. Word spread through the tank battalions with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. Kovacs' crew had taken a direct hit from an 88mm gun and survived. The mockery stopped. By the next morning, there was a line of tank commanders at the motor pool asking Kovacs to explain his design. Patterson, who'd gone from terrified teenager to enthusiastic evangelist overnight, was showing off the impact point like it was a religious relic. "Look at this," he'd say, running his fingers over the gouged armor skirt. "That's an 88mm shell that didn't kill us." The evidence was impossible to argue with. Within a week, half the tanks in the battalion had some form of improvised armor skirts welded to their hulls. Some crews copied Kovacs' design exactly. Others experimented with their own variations, using different spacing, thicker plates, or multiple layers. The motor pool became a 24-hour fabrication shop with tanks waiting in line for modifications like cars at a body shop. Lieutenant Morrison, to his credit, reversed his position immediately. He not only approved the modifications but started documenting them with photographs and detailed descriptions. He sent reports up the chain of command describing the improvised armor's effectiveness and requesting official approval for the field modifications. The response from Ordnance Department was predictably bureaucratic. The proposed modifications have not been tested under controlled conditions and cannot be officially endorsed at this time. However, field commanders are authorized to exercise discretion regarding battlefield expedients, provided such modifications do not compromise vehicle mobility or mechanical function. In plain English, we're not saying you should do this, but we're not saying you shouldn't. So, if it works, keep doing it, and if it fails, don't blame us. The 2nd Armored Division took improvised armor to the next level during the Normandy campaign. By June 1944, their Sherman tanks were sporting armor configurations that would have made Ordnance Department engineers weep or possibly applaud, depending on their tolerance for chaos. Some tanks had track links welded in overlapping patterns across the entire front glacis, creating a scale-like appearance. Others used salvaged German armor plate, which had the psychological bonus of killing Germans with their own steel. One particularly enterprising crew commander acquired actual Panther tank side skirts from a destroyed German vehicle and mounted them on his Sherman. The irony of protecting an American tank with German armor wasn't lost on anyone. Another innovation emerged from the bocage hedgerow fighting in Normandy. Crews discovered that German Panzer IV anti-tank weapons, the handheld-shaped charge rockets that could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor, were less effective against spaced armor. The standoff distance created by armor skirts disrupted the shaped charge jet, causing it to dissipate before reaching the main hull. This was accidental discovery through survival. Nobody planned it. Crews just noticed that tanks with improvised armor were surviving Panzerfaust hits that would have killed unmodified Shermans. The Germans noticed the modifications too. Intelligence reports from mid-1944 document German tank crews and anti-tank gun operators expressing frustration at American tanks' increased survivability. One captured German after-action report from a Panther battalion commander noted, "American Sherman tanks are now frequently equipped with additional external armor. Shots that should achieve penetration are instead resulting in deflections or reduced effectiveness. Recommend targeting tracks and engine compartments where possible." That's military bureaucratus for the Americans figured out how to make their tanks harder to kill, and it's annoying. When your enemy starts changing tactics to adapt to your defenses, that's evidence your defenses are working. By autumn 1944, improvised armor had evolved from desperate field expedient to semi-official doctrine. The Army published technical bulletins describing effective spacing configurations, optimal materials, and mounting techniques. Engineer units started fabricating standardized armor kits that could be bolted onto Sherman hulls without requiring extensive welding. These factory-produced modifications included proper brackets, pre-drilled mounting holes, and armor plate of consistent thickness and quality. They were, in essence, Kovacs' homemade armor skirts, engineered for mass production. The improved armor wasn't perfect. Crews discovered limitations quickly. The additional weight, typically between 400 and 800 kilograms depending on configuration, put strain on the Sherman's suspension and engine. Fuel consumption increased by roughly 10 to 15%. Maintenance became more complicated because the armor skirts sometimes interfered with accessing repair panels and inspection hatches, and the modifications couldn't stop every threat. A perfectly perpendicular hit from an 88mm gun at close range would still penetrate. A shaped charge, with enough standoff distance, could still achieve a kill. The armor skirts were probability adjustments, not invincibility shields. They turned some certain kills into probable survivals and some probable kills into possible survivals. In a war where surviving one more engagement meant living to see tomorrow, those probability shifts meant everything. The Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, provided the ultimate test of improvised armor under the worst possible conditions. American tank units, many equipped with field-modified Shermans, faced German armor in frozen forests, where engagements happened at ranges measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. Close-range combat should have negated any advantage the armor skirts provided. At point-blank range, German guns could punch through anything short of battleship armor. But even at close range, the improvised armor proved its worth through a mechanism nobody had fully anticipated: shell deflection. When German rounds hit the angled armor skirts at very close range, some shells deflected upward or downward rather than penetrating. The deflection angles were small, often just 5 to 10 degrees, but that was enough to send shells skating over or under the main hull instead of through it. A Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division took a hit from a Tiger tank at approximately 50 meters during fighting near Manhay. The shell hit the front corner of an improvised armor skirt, deflected downward, and buried itself in the frozen ground. The crew, convinced they were already dead, sat in stunned silence for 3 seconds before their training kicked in and they returned fire. They killed the Tiger with 2 shots to the turret ring, abandoned their Sherman because the suspension was damaged, and spent the rest of the battle telling anyone who'd listen that they'd been killed by a Tiger tank, but the homemade armor had other ideas. Kovacs survived the war. His Sherman, which he'd named Pittsburgh Special in honor of his hometown and his improvised armor design, was hit 17 times by various German weapons during his combat tour. 8 of those hits struck the armor skirts. 6 resulted in no damage to the main hull. 2 penetrated the skirts, but with reduced energy that the main armor stopped. 9 hits struck parts of the tank without improvised protection, resulting in 1 engine fire, 2 track breaks, and 6 instances of what Kovacs called catastrophic pucker factor, but no actual casualties. When he was rotated stateside in April 1945, his crew threw a party and welded a plaque to the damaged armor skirt that read, "Direct Hit Club, still alive to talk about it. Patterson." The loader who'd helped build the first armor skirts while terrified of burning to death made it home to Kansas, got married, and spent the rest of his life telling the story of how a Pittsburgh welder's crazy idea had saved his life on Valentine's Day, 1944. The legacy of improvised tank armor extended far beyond World War II. When the Army developed the M48 Patton tank in the early 1950s, it included factory-installed spaced armor as standard equipment. The M60 tank, which entered service in 1960, featured sophisticated spaced armor configurations, incorporating the lessons learned from Sergeant Kovacs and thousands of other tank crews who'd welded scrap metal to their vehicles in Italian motor pools and French hedgerows. The M1 Abrams tank, which remains America's primary battle tank today, uses composite armor with multiple layers and air gaps as its foundational design principle. The engineers who designed that armor were working with advanced materials, computer modeling, and decades of ballistic research. But the core concept remained unchanged. Multiple layers, with spacing defeat enemy penetrators more effectively than single-layer armor of equivalent weight. Modern reactive armor, the explosive tiles that detonate outward when hit to disrupt incoming shells, is essentially a high-tech evolution of the same principle. You're using an outer layer to disrupt the penetrator before it reaches the main armor. Whether that outer layer is a 10mm steel plate held on with brackets, or a sophisticated explosive reactive armor tile that costs $5,000, the physics are fundamentally identical. The Israeli Defense Forces, which have faced anti-tank threats in virtually every conflict since 1948, took improvised armor to an art form. Their modified M51 Sherman tanks, which fought in the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War, featured comprehensive armor packages that would have made Kovacs proud. Later, when they developed the Merkava tank series, Israeli engineers incorporated every lesson about spaced armor, reactive tiles, and crew survivability that decades of combat experience had taught them. The Merkava's design philosophy explicitly prioritizes crew survival above all other considerations. A direct legacy of tankers in wars past, who learned that living to fight tomorrow is more important than perfect armor thickness specifications. The improvised armor phenomenon repeated itself in Iraq and Afghanistan when American troops began adding scrap metal, sandbags, and commercial steel plating to Humvees that had never been designed for combat. The solutions were crude, often ineffective against improvised explosive devices, and generally mocked by people who weren't driving through ambush zones. But they represented the same impulse that drove Kovacs to his welding torch in 1944. The absolute refusal to sit idle while inadequate protection got people killed. Eventually, the Army developed the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, which incorporated proper armor and blast deflection features. But that development happened faster because soldiers forced the issue by modifying their own vehicles and documenting what worked. Nobody wants to see troops welding scrap metal to trucks because it means official equipment is inadequate. But that improvisation drives innovation in ways that peacetime research never can. When lives are immediately at stake, you experiment, you fail, you adapt, and you iterate until you find something that works. Then you share it, because everyone's trying to survive. The photograph still exists in the National Archives. Sergeant Mike Kovacs, standing next to his Sherman tank, Pittsburgh Special, somewhere in Italy in early 1944. The armor skirts are clearly visible, rough, welded, and obviously improvised. Kovacs isn't smiling. He looks tired, which makes sense because he was tired. But he's standing there, alive, next to a tank that should have killed him but didn't. The caption, added later by an unknown archivist, reads, Sergeant Michael Kovacs, with field-modified Sherman tank, Italy, 1944. Note improvised spaced armor credited with deflecting enemy anti-tank round. It doesn't mention the mockery. It doesn't mention the regulations he ignored or the lieutenant who told him to remove the modifications. It doesn't mention Patterson's terror or the Valentine's Day engagement or the 17 subsequent hits that Pittsburgh Special survived. History compresses these stories into captions and statistics, but behind every innovation that kept soldiers alive, there's a moment when someone decided that mockery and regulations and proper channels were less important than survival. They welded scrap metal to their tank, ignored the laughter, and proved through physics and dumb luck and sheer determination that sometimes the best solution comes not from engineering departments or procurement offices, but from a freezing motor pool where someone who's seen too many friends burn decides enough is enough.